Let's talk about Interac, the first English language education company I worked for in Japan. Interac, as far as I'm aware, is the single largest employer of ALTs in Japan. Now what that means is assistant language teacher, and that's your role in the classroom as a native English speaker while you're teaching alongside a licensed Japanese teacher who doesn't necessarily have good English skills. Now Interac works mainly with elementary schools and junior high schools. I believe there are some high school positions available, but those are pretty rare, so if you're applying to Interac, just kind of assume that you're going to be assigned to an elementary school or a junior high school, or maybe even both. Now, I applied to two companies from the United States. Obviously, I'm talking about Interac now, and the other one was Eon. I made my video about Eon several years back, and I strongly recommend that you check that one out. That video is amazing, and it'll teach you a lot about the interview process in general. And while the Eon interview process basically had me convinced that they are a really fucking sleazy company, the interview process for Interac led me to believe that they're actually a refreshingly pleasant company to work for. As with any job application these days, the first step is submitting your resume and personal statement online, and then if you're approved after that, you'll move on to your regional in-person interview. Now, if you're from a part of the world that doesn't have a lot of applicants, then perhaps you'll do the entire thing online, and maybe that's the direction that everyone's headed in now because of the COVID pandemic, but at least when I did the interview several years back, I did mine in New Jersey, which covered the US Northeast. The interview is a day-long process, starting with a group session in the morning and followed by an individual session in the afternoon. Now for the group session in the morning, there might be about 20 or so other applicants there with you, and the first thing you're going to do is just watch a presentation about Interac. After that is when things really get started, and you're going to have to do some sort of warm-up exercise in front of the classroom. That is, the other applicants are going to be your students and you're going to be the teacher. So something that might suffice is the head, shoulders, knees, and toes song, something you might actually do in Japan. And if that sounds embarrassing, don't worry about it. Everyone else is in the exact same position, and quite frankly, when you come to Japan, you're going to be doing that stuff day in and day out, so you may as well get used to it now. Just be energetic and have fun. After that, you're going to do some sort of self-introduction in both English and Japanese, and that's going to be recorded and sent to Japan. So of course you should nail the English side, but on the Japanese side, put a little bit of effort in, but it's okay if you completely suck. I mean, quite frankly, some places want people who can't speak Japanese because that just means they're going to be speaking more English wherever they go. And at the end of the day, that is the job of an ALT in a Japanese school. However, some schools will request teachers who can actually speak Japanese pretty well, because sometimes they'll want to work with you in Japanese if no one at that school can speak English particularly well. And the last thing you might do in the morning is take an English quiz, which as a native English speaker, you should ace. And of course, if you suck at grammar, maybe you should brush up a little, but for the most part, it's not something to worry about. Then everyone takes a lunch break and you'll be scheduled for a designated time to come back in the afternoon for your individual session. At the individual interview, they're going to ask you about your preferences for living in Japan. For example, are you willing to live out in the middle of nowhere? Are you willing to drive a car to work? How many years are you planning to live in Japan? And if you answer flexibly, of course, they're more likely to hire you, but at the same time, you should be honest because you don't want to end up in a situation that you don't like. And after that, you're going to move on to what I think is the hardest part of the interview, and that is your 3 to 5 minute sort of demo lesson. Once again, this is the kind of demo lesson you might do in an actual Japanese classroom, and it can be on basically any topic. I believe I did mine on common verbs like running, walking, eating, and things like that. The important thing is that you speak loudly and clearly and slowly, use a lot of gestures, and if you can do that, I think they'll be satisfied. And after that, you might be asked to read some random paragraph in English out loud, and for that, once again, you just have to read slowly, clearly, and loudly, and if you can do that, you should be fine. After that, your interview's basically over, and then they'll notify you in a few weeks whether you passed or not. After you've been notified that you've passed the interview, they're going to give you some sort of placement offer. For example, they might say, hey, we have this school opening in Ibaraki. Would you like to work there? And if you say yes and all your paperwork checks out for immigration, you'll be teaching there in a matter of months. But if you say no and you do have the right to decline, you'll be sent to the back of the list, and then a few months down the line, they might come back to you with another placement offer. But still, there's no guarantee that's going to be any better than your first placement offer, so in general, I recommend taking whatever they give you, unless you have a really specific reason not to. When you first get to Japan, you're going to spend a lot of time with the Interac staff. For example, you might have to do some sort of teacher training in the Tokyo area, and then they're going to send you out to your individual town where the local staff is going to help you set up your apartment, your car, your bank account, your cell phone, all that good stuff, and then they'll take you to your school to do some sort of self-introduction before you actually start teaching. But after that, they are pretty hands-off. They might come back once more in person just to make sure everything's okay during that first month, and after that, they'll just send forms and ask the school to review you and make sure that they're happy with you, and as long as the school is happy with you, your job is pretty secure. They might do a demo lesson or observation lesson maybe once a year at most if you're in a particularly important location or school, but otherwise they may not stop by even for that. Everything sounds great so far, right? So what's the catch? Well, don't worry, I do have my complaints about Interac. The first one being the expense of having a car. I was under the impression that they were going to subsidize you to the point that it would be a pretty even choice between driving and having a biking position. And even at that, it seemed like they wanted to encourage people to be drivers, so they would probably subsidize you a lot. But by my calculation, it was less than half the cost of having a car, and that kind of sucks because it does really get expensive there. And it wasn't such a big deal for me. I did like having the freedom of having a car, and I wasn't really in a financially vulnerable position, but a lot of my colleagues were still in student debt and they really needed every penny they could save, so it kind of sucked for them. Another thing I didn't like about Interac was their sort of my way or the highway attitude towards teacher training. I mean, they had their one way that they wanted to teach, and if you broke their rules, you were wrong. Period. And I thought that was ridiculous. I mean, everyone has their own style that works best for them. Not everyone can always be Captain Flair from Eon or some cheerleader who's always hyped up on pixie sticks. Everyone has their own style, and I developed mine through experience, through trial and error, and I got great reviews at the end of the day from my school. But when Interac would come back and be inflexible in their criticism of my really effective teaching style, I found that to be downright infuriating. Finally, Interac has some really burdensome policies that have nothing to do with teaching and only serve to uphold their own reputation in some weird, sort of random hypothetical way. For example, let's say you get a non-driving position, but you end up getting your Japanese driver's license, you get a car, you want to drive to school, right? But Interac will say no, because what if you end up hitting a kid? I mean, they can't risk that you might ruin their reputation like that. And let's say, on the other hand, you're in a driving position, but after a year, your international permit expires and you're still unable to get a Japanese driver's license. What if you want to hitch a ride to school with another teacher at your school? Well, they're still going to say, no, you can't do that. That'll make them look bad. And they have all kinds of ridiculous policies like this. I'd say their single worst policy is that if you want to move out of that initial apartment they set you up with into a new place and you need what's called a guarantor to do that, which is a common requirement for Japanese real estate companies, Interac will only serve as your guarantor if they can put their name on the lease instead of yours, which basically gives them the power to kick you out whenever they want. It's disgusting. Anyway, despite my complaints, I still think that Interac is an okay company to work for, at least for your first job in Japan, but once you get some more experience under your belt, you can probably move up to a higher paying job that gives you a lot more freedom, and that's exactly what I did with my second job in Japan. I'll talk about that in another video, but for now, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.